Hi everyone and welcome to Hit the Apex this week. It's the Russian Grand Prix. We've got 6 races to go in the championship, but it almost seems a little bit on the side this week considering what else is going on in the world of sport, particularly if you're here in Australia and in Melbourne with 2 lots of footy finals. So we'll get to that a bit later. You might as well rename it Hit the Post this week because we'll be talking probably more footy anyway on this podcast, but we've still got the Russian Grand Prix on to preview. So as always, I'm not Baden, I'm Jawad, joined by Baden, getting the wires a bit crossed already, but yeah, here
having
we
an
are.
out-of-body experience here, are we?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just the sunshine. I'm so glad to see it after a long, dreary winter. But anyway, let's do the F1 first. We've got the Russian Grand Prix on this weekend. It moves back to its slot later in the season. And, you know, it's hard to believe that we've only got 6 races to go. And given that the championship is not as delicately poised as we had hoped it to be, it's a 40-point lead for Lewis Hamilton over Sebastian Vettel. You might as well say that Brit's already got one hand on the trophy.
At this point, it's pretty similar to last year where it went for all to play for after the mid-season break to all over in 2 or 3 races, and we did say it at Singapore that it was now or never, but it really is. This coming 2 weekends, you could say, back-to-back with Japan. Ferrari doesn't win either of them. They really probably have to win both, but if Hamilton wins this weekend, that essentially is it, and Ferrari probably best served turning its attention towards 2019, as sad as it would be to admit. It's come around that quickly.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, that given all the hype going into the mid-season break and then coming out of it, Belgium at least sort of reminded us that it could be a 2-horse race, but since then it's sort of just petered away into the hands of Mercedes, and we come to a race now which Mercedes have had a stranglehold upon since 2014 when the Russian Grand Prix joined the calendar, and then Lewis Hamilton has won 2 of those. Then, of course, we had Nico Rosberg and Valtteri Bottas take victory as well last year. If Hamilton wins this race, he can finish P2 in the 5 remaining races after that and still win the title, pending wherever Sebastian Vettel finishes. So it is all for Ferrari to play for, as you say, this weekend. And now we've got another back-to-back. There's been so many double headers this year, so you know I think we're into the final one, hopefully, for this year. But yeah, Japan and Russia this weekend are going to be pretty crucial. And you'd think on paper, again, we say on paper that Ferrari could be the stronger team here, and in Japan, of course, as well, where the chassis really comes into its own. But given all the errors that they've made, you know, and all the mistakes that have come throughout the season, it looks like it's going to cost them another title.
Yeah, we'll see. Friday and Saturday, they really do look like the team to beat that long-run pace, but Hamilton just switches it on when it does count there, whether it's Q3 or on race day. Ferrari just choking, that they're leading comfortably, and for whatever reason, again, we mention every week, it seems blinking first and really harries them, I guess, into struggling on worn sets of tyres later in the race, and Hamilton managing it so well. They're really just there to be devoured, the Ferraris, and it's something they just don't learn from. Last year we thought they'd gotten over it coming into 2018, but they've just regressed into those old habits. And you think Russia last year, it looked like Ferrari had a good chance of winning, but Bottas really managed those tyres well, and that was ultimately his debut victory.
Yeah, that was too, and Vettel was runner-up to Bottas on 2 occasions, even in Austria last year. And yeah, I guess if the race was a couple of laps longer, you would have reckoned that Bottas would have been swallowed up by Vettel. But quickly, while you brought up the fact of the tyres as well, it's interesting to note that, again, Ferrari have decided to max out on the softest compounded tyre, being the Hypersoft in this instance for Sebastian Vettel's side of the garage. And that's what caught him out in Singapore and in Monza too, that the fact that they didn't have enough of the, let's call it the hard tyre or whatever, or the medium tyre that they had allocated to them, and Mercedes were able to use that in the race and really capitalise, because Ferrari only brought one set for the whole weekend. They couldn't really get any practice running out of it, given that that's their sole set, and they've made the same decision for the next race in Japan as well, not bringing enough of those harder compound tyres to at least have a bit of a run in practice on. So again, are they going to be caught short when it comes to the race strategy?
They've gone all in, really. It's going to go one way or another. There's not really going to be any kind of middle ground you can see there, and they're at that point where essentially they have nothing to lose. They'll look like absolute magicians if it comes off, but Mercedes has really upped its game the last few races, and just on that strategic front, they seem bulletproof. So Ferrari, the first time they see Mercedes look like trying something alternative, they'll go in and take the first option, and that often really seems to be lights out. Whether it's a lap 10, lap 15, there's no coming back from it, and really feels like we're in this vortex discussing the same predictable plot every week at the moment.
Basically, yeah, it's the case. But given that Russia in the past has been a circuit where tyre degradation's been non-existent, and every year we say they've got to bring the softest possible tyre, this year they've gone for the hyper soft tyre. Yet those tyres still this year haven't really had a lot of degradation, so we could still see a one-stop strategy utilised. But if in the position, I really want to see Ferrari get a bit aggressive and say, well, yeah, if we don't have the hard tyre or whatever, medium in this instance, why don't we just try and win the race by using hypersoft, And as you say, they've got nothing to lose given the situation they're in, but at the same time, it feels like they're going to be conservative as always.
It just seems ingrained in the culture, and that idea with Vettel perhaps calling the shots from the cockpit, whether he's stepped in here and just said, right, I'm prepared to sacrifice the rest of my championship here to make it work, and he's just taken that executive action, you could say. Just something has to be done, and at this stage, really, you've got to say that it's fairly likely it's not going to come off, so probably in the off-season they've got to work towards it. But for now, hypersofts, earlier in the year they tended to make them work, but for whatever reason, ever since Vettel at Germany, they've just seemed really as though they've been uncertain of themselves every weekend. A little bit of bad luck with the weather in there, but ultimately just being outplayed on every department by Mercedes, and Mercedes really swinging each way with tyre selections there, and they tend to manage the rubber a lot better than they were, again, themselves in the earlier races.
Yet Ferrari still have the better car, and they still can't win. It's just, it's hard to put two and two together, but it's the case. It's Ferrari. They seem to make a hash of it every time. So that's what the picture looks like at the front. Going over to Bottas, as we just talked about him before, he won this race last year, and he's typically been strong here in the past, even back when he was with Williams. But he's been winless so far this season, and given that Hamilton, I guess, is in the position he is, even though Hamilton said that he's still got to come to every race aiming to win it, would Mercedes be in the sort of mindset, well, we could give Bottas a race win this weekend, if they're in that position too, given what happened to him in Hungary and also in Germany. It'd be nice to give him a bit of a reward for what he's done this season. Mm-hmm. And I guess for his confidence as well. I mean, ever since the whole wingman incident, he has been a little down on confidence as well. You could see he's been a bit nowhere. I mean, even Kimi Raikkonen's been stronger than Bottas in this middle to latter part of the season.
You can't see Mercedes outright handing it to Bottas, but if Hamilton, for whatever reason, has one of those rare weekends where he's off his game, he'll be quite content not to put his nose in anywhere where it's going to cause a collision. Like last year a few times he probably got caught out there, and what happened at Mexico, that collision he had, he still clinched the title there, but falling way down the field. So I think Hamilton will be very composed this point out. He knows he's really got that margin there, and Ferrari, even with a Bottas leading, they'll probably still find a way to be ambivalent about it when they need to be covering, I guess, Hamilton and the bigger picture of wherever he might be. They might be looking, the victory's there, instead of we might just take some points away from Hamilton. They've got to start with something, but at this point it seems as though whatever the grid might be, they'll start first and second, Hamilton's fourth, dare we say, and yet for whatever reason, strategy time, switcheroo, and Hamilton's off in the sunset. It just seems very uncanny that they have an advantage and they just find a way to gift it to Mercedes.
Yeah, their undercuts always never seem to work, as we've seen in the past few races, and Russia too is not a track that really promotes overtaking, you could say, as well. It's very hard, and I guess to get in front of someone, they're going to have to look at strategy, and we only saw that last year with Vettel and Bottas, the fact that Vettel just, he was so much quicker than the Mercedes, but couldn't find his way past. So, it's going to be more of that this year. So emphasis will be there on qualifying too. And the reason I say Bottas could be an outsider this weekend is because 2014, the very first race, he could have been on pole position in a Williams if he didn't stuff up his exit from the final corner. So, it's just something about this track that suits Bottas. And even Raikkonen has been typically strong here as well. But just don't let him get close to Bottas, because we know what's happened a couple of years ago between those two coming together. But you get the feeling that, given that Vettel's title aspirations are on the line this weekend, as they are every single race, that if needed, Ferrari are going to use Raikkonen for Vettel as a scapegoat, whatever you want. So yeah, it all comes down to what happens with those top four positions with those top four guys.
Has to be remembered, though, Raikkonen, man unchanged since that announcement that he's being replaced by Leclerc. You'd have to wonder that at this point he might go against the protocol and just get his elbows out. We saw at Singapore he wasn't really a factor, but that was across the board. Ferrari just couldn't get it together, and you'd think, based on what he did show last year, he was very competitive, and Ferrari did sacrifice him for Vettel's betterment, and that never eventuated. So for Raikkonen, you never know. If he's looking legitimately more competitive, then stranger things have happened, and maybe he does have the mindset he's got nothing to lose. He might even take a risk in diving into a corner because he's that desperate to get, really realistically, the final victory of his career, which we keep harping on about, and really we got so close to at Italy and didn't come to pass. So if he's got it there on the taking, you wouldn't blame him for being a bit selfish.
Yeah, free agent, as it were, but at the same time, does he sacrifice himself for his great mate Sebastian Vettel? Of course, we know they're friends, and given that the title probably means a lot more to Ferrari, I guess, up until now, Kimi's been the team player and everything, and, placid as he is, could he just put it on the line again to please the team and to please his teammates? So that'll be the key thing to look out for. So yeah, between Ferrari and Mercedes, you've got to say that that's the race win locked out. Red Bull look like they're probably going to be fighting themselves again this weekend, fighting reliability perhaps between Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen. Even though it was only sixth, it was nice to see Ricciardo finish a race last time out, and dare we say it, he might not even race this weekend. He might decide to fly to Melbourne and watch the grand final, given his beloved West Coast in the top spot there. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Not that I doubt that's going to happen.
Danny Kvyat parachuted back in the scene where his career effectively ended 2 years ago.
Yeah, for Red Bull, so that would be pretty good for Kvyat to do that. But yeah, Red Bull, they're just going to be fighting themselves, and I guess it's just about personal pride as well for Ricciardo, as it is with Raikkonen, given that he's on the out of the team by the end of the year. Talk about the C-spec or going back to the B-spec Renault engine and whatnot. It sort of doesn't mean anything, given that Red Bull as well are separating from Renault at the end of the year and going to Honda next year.
Yeah, just marking time for all parties there, and it's a shame the way that when you think back to where it started for Ricciardo with Red Bull, and we did think he was going to be that next nucleus for the title, but then Max Verstappen came along, and then just poor fortune this year is a damn squib for him to go out. And then for Red Bull itself with Renault, the heights of 4 or 5 years ago when they were just looking absolutely untouchable, and Renault pretty jilted. They never got the credit they deserved, so it's fair enough the way the sourness has probably overshadowed what's been an extremely successful collaboration.
Yeah, it seems like a really long time ago now when you think about it, when Red Bull were in that position. So, a completely different era. So even though it's, as you say, only 4 or 5 years ago. So, yeah, it really has. Mercedes have really owned the sport over the last 4 or 5 years. And, the Red Bull dynasty that was just doesn't seem to exist when you look back. But yeah, anyway, moving it on, and in the midfield you should have your usual shenanigans between Renault, Haas and Force India as well. Haas, of course, they're going to be contesting that disqualification from the Italian Grand Prix as well, but they had a pretty shocking weekend out in Singapore with none of their cars finishing in the points. Renault were in the points, Force India as well. Ocon and Perez not allowed to race according to the team, given the clash that happened on the first lap in Singapore. So how does that affect the team mentality and the morale of the drivers? Ocon, of course, fighting for his future in F1, but we're hearing perhaps, talks with Williams are progressing, so perhaps he could end up there, as I've said pretty much since he had no hope of going to McLaren and to Renault. So yeah, it's good. Force India is going to be an interesting one to watch, but they've been strong here in the past and points could be still on the cards for them.
Yeah, really just reclawing those points that were wiped mid-season with the notional rebirth, even though barely anything's changed on the surface. And it's just a shame that after that stern talking to they'd had after a few coming together's last season, and then wasn't it this year as well at Azerbaijan? Did they have a friendly fire? Was it the first lap?
And they went on to finish on the podium still, did Perez. So
when you think about it, like, it's just come to this, two quality races, and it has to be the blame as well when you see what went on for Perez after that with Sirotkin. He seemed to have the red mist about him, and for Ocon, he's just... it just exacerbates what's been a fraught situation for him when he's continued that upswing, but it looks like his immediate future in the sport's very bleak. Yeah,
well, up until Brazil last year, he didn't have a DNF to his name since that debut with Manor a couple of years ago. Yet, since that Brazil DNF, every other DNF he's had have all been on the first lap as well, so he gets caught up in some awful little situations there, and to be caught up with your teammate as well, I think it's the worst thing. And given the history between these two guys, going back to Belgium last year, it's just, they're probably hoping that next year it's going to be a lot more calmer without the tension between the two there. But it's all, I guess, part of the game is you got to beat your teammate, and some people go a bit too far with it.
Yeah, it just seems as though they need to know their place, and maybe Perez acting as though he's some sort of benefactor, the way that he intervened there with that forced administration to get things rolling. I don't know if that one's really gone to his head, but you never know if it could affect his own negotiations, since he still hasn't confirmed his own destination for 2019, so there's still a bit to play out there.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't really think that he'd be going anywhere else, given that Ocon's on the outer from Force India, so it should be Perez that takes that second seat there. But moving it on, McLaren and Williams continue to struggle, and I guess on a high-speed track like Russia as well, expect them not really to be in there. Fernando Alonso could jag some points out as always, but at the same time he could just retire 2 or 3 laps into the race, and given that Sergei Sirotkin's home track as well, you'd hope that he would be able to put on a decent show for his home fans, but given where Williams are at the moment, it seems unlikely.
Oh, I love the Putin boost there, just to please the local leader there. Not many people will be familiar with him, but I'm sure that there'll be some strings pulled to make sure that the local man has some chance at least of being in the action at some point.
Reverse grid to put Sirotkin on pole if he qualifies last.
Oh, stranger things have happened when you've got that vested interest in a local talent, just suddenly a bit of an outlier result, and you wonder how it's happened. Maybe a little bit of a push here or there from certain powers that be.
And also, they've named a grandstand after him too. Ironically enough, that was the Danny Kvyat grandstand a year ago when he was still racing. So they've just taken his picture off and put the other driver's picture on there. But speaking of Danny Kvyat, it could be likely that this weekend it's announced that he will be returning to Toro Rosso next year, which we already talked about last week. It's just you all know how we feel about that. He is a talented young driver, and it was sad to see him treated the way he was by Red Bull. But the fact that they've backpedaled again is just like, well, their relevance is just quickly diminishing, basically. So that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, the way that last year when they had to return to someone from 8 years earlier, and then all the talk this year about Buemi and all the types, and Verne even for a time there, and then you've got a Tictum who continues to disgrace himself, as we'll touch on imminently. They really have probably floated away a long way from the initial remit that Toro Rosso was meant to serve, apart from Sebastian Vettel and to an extent Max Verstappen, even though he was brought in externally. They're the only two that really have vindicated the program.
Yeah, exactly. So more on Tictum, as you say, a bit later. But yeah, we'll see whether that announcement is made or not, given that it is the Russian Grand Prix weekend. And quickly, FP1 outings for, I think Artem Markelov will be in the Renault. We'll have Antonio Giovinazzi in the Sauber, of course. More on him in a sec. And, of course, Lando Norris jumping into the McLaren as well. So quite a few new faces on the grid. And we'll go into the digest straight away now as well. And the big news to come out over the past few days has been that Antonio Giovinazzi will be with Sauber next year as a race driver. He replaces Marcus Ericsson, who has been demoted, if you will, to the role of third driver and brand ambassador. So I guess a way of keeping his investors happy as well was to keep him part of the team, but as a third driver.
And very magnanimous about it. He did handle it very cordially. Wasn't really an outburst you've seen in the past. These drivers who act like they've got by default a lifetime drive, and he probably knows his place, and he's probably been done no harm by holding a candle to Charles Leclerc, and we know his future, so you can see that he's potentially got a future himself to get back on to the grid. And compared to where he was when he debuted with Caterham, no one thought that he'd amount to anything, so he's certainly far from the worst driver I've seen in the last decade or so.
Yeah, and he's exactly, and he has scored points for Sauber on occasion as well, and in the early part of the year he was matching Leclerc here and there, but then, once the youngster came into his own, then he sort of took off. But yeah, Ericsson, not a bad guy either, so wouldn't be good if he dropped off the grid altogether, but to see him in that third driver role, still pretty good. But for Giovinazzi, I guess, another Ferrari driver finds himself on the grid. And then, of course, first Italian driver since 2011 to be on the F1 grid. We sort of forgot what it was like having an Italian driver, given we had Tony Liuzzi and Jarno Trulli on the grid together previously, but also for Alfa Romeo as a brand, being represented by an Italian driver. I think that's going to be pretty significant too.
And you'd hope for Giovinazzi earlier on in the season, when we go to Australia at least, he raced at China as well, and that was a few little disastrous crashes he had there into the final turn, but at least he got that taste of it in 2017, so whether that means he's got a little bit of a head start there. But of course he's had a pretty lean year 2018, hasn't done much racing, so you wonder if he will be a little bit rusty. Nevertheless, at his age, it's just good to see that he's been given that opportunity rather than probably another year in the wilderness and he would have missed the boat.
Yeah, exactly. I think he did a bit of endurance racing for a Ferrari GT team, and of course the simulator work as well for Ferrari throughout the year in the Formula One team. So yeah, it's really we don't think about it much, given that we've got this season still to play out. But next year's going to be interesting with all the changes across the grid, and not just in the midfield, but with some of those big drivers as well. Daniel Ricciardo certainly a big mover in that, and then all the other little pieces, Kimi Raikkonen and Charles Leclerc moving up. It's going to be really exciting to see.
I think it's brought more to the forefront by the way this championship's petered out the last few races. You just want it to roll on for 2019.
Let's get ready for winter testing already for next year and see everyone in their new gear and also the new liveries on the cars. Let's fast forward to February already. But anyway, a lot more to play out throughout the year anyway in the world of motorsport and F1 as well. Dan Ticktum, he lost the plot over the weekend at the F3.
Or as I've titled him, Tan Dictum.
Yeah, well, whatever you want to call him. It's just, losing the plot more or less, and hard to believe that he's still on Red Bull's books as a potential driver of the future. The only reason he wasn't drafted into Toro Rosso for next year is because he hasn't qualified for a super license yet. But
because he did something a few years ago that probably wasn't the most sporting.
No, not at all. And on that basis, he shouldn't be even given that chance, I guess, given that how ruthless Red Bull have been about other drivers. But I guess that's sort of the side story, in the fact that it was Mick Schumacher who won his 5th straight Formula 3 race over the weekend, and has a stranglehold on that championship now. And I guess why Ticktum lost the plot was all the accusing that he did towards Schumacher about, the car being illegal or some cheating going on, and relating back to his name as well and the presence that his name brings. So,
This idea that Prem suddenly got 100% focus on Schumacher when they've got considerable roster of drivers there. Ticktum just thinks suddenly because he won that race and he's been on a roll ever since at Belgium, there's some sort of bum steer being given to him, and making the point of mentioning that he's not complaining at all, and then going on to have quite a vitriolic rant. It's sour grapes from him, and coupled with that history he's had a few years ago, doesn't fill anyone with much confidence about his future. And probably Red Bull, good luck to them if they're still keen on him in the next year or so. But if he doesn't get that title, who knows if that'll ever call.
Oh, of course, he'll blame the car and everything for it and say that Schumacher cheated like his father or something like that. Not that I'm implying that, but yeah, that's something that Ticktum would say for sure. But yeah, no, such a good run of form for Mick Schumacher, and of course fully expecting him next season to move up to Formula 2 at least, and spend a couple of years there, perhaps win the title, and then 2021 F1 should be on the horizon.
Now, who knows, if he wins the F2 title, he'll probably be forced into F1 since they have that stupid rule where you can't defend the title.
If he wins the title in his first year as a rookie, that would be quite something. Of course, George Russell looks set to do that this year if Lando Norris can't find a way to stop him. But yeah, it would be great to see for young Mick. So, we've been quietly watching his progress over the past few years, and it's good to see that he's not being rushed into anything. He is making his way up the ladder, and in the beginning we didn't see this sort of form from him, so it's just something that's coming naturally through, and by the time he does get to F1, hopefully he'll be in that position where he can challenge the status quo drivers, where we expect guys like Gasly, Leclerc and all that to be at the top of the top of F1. Ocon hopefully too.
He's found his feet really since that victory, and it just seems as though the rest is falling into place now, just that belief that he can do it. And you've seen that drive on the weekend that the Red Bull ring was in the wet, and he had some pretty masterful control of the car, which is quite reminiscent of his father. So there's some really striking resemblances there that can be counted on. If he's given that chance, you just never know what he's capable of. And you've got to remember as well, I think we mentioned last edition that his cousin there in David Schumacher, he's also very handy and probably has escaped the limelight, but there's a good chance in the next 2 or 3 years we'll have multiple Schumachers on the grid once more.
Yeah, and hopefully it's not the same as Ralph and Michael, where David could actually be a bit more competitive than his old man was. So yeah, that would be good to see. Moving it on, Sebastian Buemi, you brought him up just before. He's confirmed his future in Formula E, so there was a bit of talk about him perhaps filling in Toro Rosso next year, coming back to F1, but he's committed his future to FE with Nissan, who've, I guess Renault have rebranded themselves as Nissan for the next season, so, he's going to be there. And one thing I'm really disappointed about is that, his teammate's going to be Alexander Albon, and of course,
he's a terrible driver. How dare they select him?
No, not in that. Disappointed, not in that sense. I'm disappointed that F1 have let another good driver like Albon go to Formula E. And Albon, of course, we know his story. He didn't even have a contract for F2 this year, yet he came out. He won a couple of races. He was binned from the Toro Rosso, or from the Red Bull Junior program as well a couple of years ago. So they bin him, yet they have a complete hack like Ticktum on board. That just tells you something about Helmut Marko these days. So, Buemi and Albon will be a formidable duo at Nissan for Formula E, but, Albon in an F1 car would be so much better.
I guess it does speak to Formula E's growing stature that these considerations, even from recycled talents, have come a lot more into that consideration in the last 12 to 18 months, and initially where it was really the reject shop, and now you're seeing legitimate contention from someone who might win a title there. They've got a chance to reignite their career, and you hope for Albon at this younger age that if he goes in and dominates from the outset, that he might turn some heads immediately. And if it's not Red Bull again wanting to welcome him back into the family, then someone else will be pretty keen on him.
Yeah, I hope so, that Red Bull don't get their hands on him again this time. So that'll be good to see. And Formula E, I think, not too far from starting again for its new season with those new era cars. So Miami Grand Prix, the vote on that race has been deferred again by the council. The deadline's been passed and there's been no decision, so it looks like we might have to wait from 2 to 10 years for them.
They'll announce when the deadline's over and they've come to the decision in 2030.
In 2030.
Time for the race to be 10 years afterwards.
Yeah, so, we might be waiting until, another 2 decades before this race happens, but I'm sure Chase Carey and Liberty Media will be keen to still make it happen.
Very symptomatic, though, of the way that F1 seems to deal with America. Very few and far between cases of having it work, and when it does, it's only ever a short to medium-term proposition, as we saw with Indianapolis, and even talk that the Texas quotas are probably not long for the calendar. The next 2 or 3 years might be it, and then IndyCar seems as though it might be the primary user of the facility.
Yeah, they're going there next year, of course, IndyCar, but it's a shame again because Miami was really shaping up to be the centerpiece for Liberty Media's Formula One, and then talking about Las Vegas and Long Beach, even if IndyCar loses their spot there, all this talk, yet nothing's really coming of it. So again, the US seems to be a harder market for F1 to breach, and we would have thought that with Liberty Media, with that Americanized focus, that they would be able to finally crack it, but it doesn't seem like it's the case anyway. But still, you never know, it still could happen in a couple of years' time, but we just got to wait with our breaths bated.
I think post-2020 again is that crucial year where things might come a little bit easier. It seems as though the holding pattern, there's a bit more ambition you can see from Liberty this year. Things have ramped up a little, and there's been maybe a few more notable misses. Not that they've been failing on those hits, but it probably seems until they have the complete autonomy with the new agreement from 2021, that things will fall into place a lot easier.
Yeah, even that still seems a bit ambivalent, but as we get closer, I guess things will sort of fall into place, as you say. But it's hard not to be a little bit worried about what to expect, given that there's zero manufacturer interest now for 2021, talk about the rules even staying the same, yet, there could be a radical visual overhaul aerodynamically again, so it's just, we've got to wait and see what happens. It's just all about the waiting game.
Yeah, probably do hope that with the interim aero changes for 2019, it at least means we've got some pretty good racing and spectacle with overtaking for the few seasons in that interim, rather than holding out for whatever it might be, 21 or dare we say 23, if everyone wants to just continue the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I don't know, we'll just have to wait and see, as we say. So yeah, switching to two wheels quickly, and it's been a pretty dismal season for Yamaha in MotoGP. It's been their longest winless streak, which goes back to last year. The Dutch Grand Prix was the last time Valentino Rossi won, and since then Yamaha have not won a Grand Prix, and it's just going from bad to worse for them. And Valentino himself this year recently has come out and said that perhaps Yamaha should look at potentially changing the engine for next year. They've been using an inline 4 ever since they've been in the Grand Prix motorcycle class, and he's calling to switch to a V4 engine, so instead of the inline 4 that they've got. And I guess tradition, history, Japanese teams, that's pretty key with those guys. Do they really want to switch? They probably don't, but I guess Rossi's just trying to put some pressure on them to do something about next season, given that this year's a write-off and it looks like they're not going to win a Grand Prix.
Yeah, it's been a real annus horribilis, and for Rossi, it's probably up there with some of those years he had at Ducati. Even so, he's still maintained a pretty competitive standing there without any of that real success. And for Yamaha, if they're going to listen to somebody, it's got to be a Valentino Rossi. So as much as they have that tradition and honour and old habits, upholding them, at a certain point, if they're going down a pathway and there's no sign of improvement, they've got to give it a go, and they can always return back to this I4 philosophy down the track. But otherwise, it's impossible to see Marquez really any time the next 2 or 3 years being dethroned.
Yeah, unless it was, of course, from Ducati, which, the last few races, they've really been pretty strong and everything. And, of course, now next year, Jorge Lorenzo going to Honda to partner, a partner Marc Marquez. And we saw a bit of fireworks between those two over the weekend in Aragon, of course, with Lorenzo blaming Marquez for him going off at turn 1. So, if that's the sort of friction that already is there, imagine them two as teammates.
Yeah, it's a matter of time, and you were mentioning earlier that that idea that Lorenzo might be found on his haunches pretty quickly coming into the den of Marquez at a different establishment. They probably run things a bit differently to what he's used to from Yamaha and even Ducati, which is probably a bit more fiery, you could say, with that Italian passion. So I think the next 6-12 months will be very telling whether Lorenzo's put himself on a downward scale, which has been the case probably since he moved from Yamaha, with that slight resurgence this year. But as far as getting back into being legitimately a title contender, it's a very big year ahead for him.
Big year ahead, but the thing is, I guess, but the differences between the Yamaha and the Ducati and the Honda is that the Honda is a bike that you can easily just roll out anywhere and anyone can be comfortable on it, whereas the Ducati, you really have to work towards it. And given that Dovizioso's been there for so long, and he basically was there at the start of this revival going back to the post-Rossi era and when Luigi Dall'Igna came into the team, I guess he's sort of formed that bike around him, and I reckon he, along with Danilo Petrucci next year, should be pretty strong. But for Lorenzo to come from a different philosophy from Yamaha over Ducati, it would have been harder, and that's what took him a year and a half to get for the bike to suit his needs, whereas I think on the Honda he could be a lot quicker straight out of the box. But yeah, for me it's going to be about the rivalry and the teammate dynamic between he and Marquez. There could be a wall erected again like in the Yamaha days between Rossi and Lorenzo, I reckon.
Bit of fire and water there when you consider the two pretty contrasting personalities. You've got Lorenzo, who's got the probably the emotion of a leaf, compared to Marquez, who's like a little cage monkey wanting to do acrobats whenever he's given the chance, and the energy there is just so contagious.
Basically, yeah. So I guess we'll leave it at that anyway for our motorsport segment, because it's time to hit the post, and I guess we've been looking forward to talking about this all day. The footy finals this weekend with the AFL and NRL, of course. AFL probably a lot more significant, certainly for one of us this year, given that their team has stunned the reigning premiers to meet West Coast at the MCG. So Collingwood, I guess we didn't really expect them to, once they made it into the top, into the playoffs or whatever, you didn't really expect them to go too far. But yeah, given that they had to play an extra week after losing to West Coast in the first round, they upset Richmond over the weekend in the prelim. Now they're in the big dance.
Don't think anybody saw this coming from 12 months ago. It was Armageddon time and lots of clean-outs there, and a few people keeping jobs when the scepticism was there that they've just really changed nothing at all. But internally, clearly a lot of restructuring there to give other people their greater responsibilities, and Nathan Buckley particularly there, he's been able to delegate it a lot more, and a lot more relief on the stress front. He can just focus on what he needs to do and just hone those aspects over the years, which really have misfired. A lot of injuries, though, have probably overshadowed the true extent of that climb. But this year they've really, again, they've had injuries through the whole season, and yet somehow they've defied it, and they've gotten on a run with some players coming back just at the right time. And yes, they had an easy draw, you might say, earlier parts of the year, but they had to win them, and they did. Got the top four, double chance, and it's no easy feat, really, when you look at what they did. 2 trips to Perth in 3 weeks, then winning ugly against GWS. That was a real danger game, and it looked for a long time there they wouldn't get the job done, but for whatever reason, that short turnaround into playing Richmond, they were a completely transformed team, and certainly a Mason Cox in particular, he just had this complete about face in confidence, and he played probably one of the best individual games the AFL's seen in the 21st century, and everyone was just taken aback. So I think that really a lot of people just still struggling to fathom the fact that Collingwood will be playing on the last day in September, regardless of what the outcome will be.
USA, USA, as everyone's getting on the bandwagon. But we'll talk about Coxie in a second anyway. But I guess you got to say that the Pies finally have a chance to fully vindicate themselves under Coach Buckley. And as you said before, the acrimony throughout his tenure, ever since Malthouse left and Buckley's come in, the fact that they've not had success, they've had a lot of, I guess, a lot of their old guard sort of be swept away, and then new players coming in being blooded, and just not a lot of success to come out of that. And all of a sudden, and then last year really was the boiling point where it was like, it's time to kick him out, but the board and the team showed the faith and retained him for another few years and whatnot. And this year he's really rewarded the club and also the team as well, given that they've really built this team, that he's built this team himself. A lot of young players that have never played finals footy before finally had the chance to play in the big game itself in the grand final. So, you must, as a proper Collingwood fan, must feel that, given that it's not a team of superstars that you've traded in from elsewhere, but it's a team that they've built up themselves and you would have watched progress over the years. It's probably more satisfying to see them win that way than having being a Geelong or whatever and picking people from all over the place.
It's been a long time coming, and the hiccups there really have probably delayed that progress, but you can see this year that they'll be fully worthy of a premiership, and people will always question that and say that happened overnight, so something clearly happened to fluke it, but they've had the right people in place and just executing, and they've got to know their roles and backing themselves without that daily pressure that seemed to be the case probably since about 2015. It was just baying for blood seemingly on a weekly basis, and now everyone, after that review, they've just been given that certainty, and you can see now that they're at a stage where probably being able to put a definitive line under that previous legacy with Mick Malthouse there, and the way that set everything back, probably that contributed as equally as injuries and maybe some just other generally poor strategic decisions off the field. And now the sole focus is on the football there, and even if it isn't to be on Saturday, I think the future at this point looks as though they're very much building to be in that top echelon for many years to come.
Well, given that, the last 2 years or whatever, the premiership winning teams have been those old teams or whatever, establishment teams or whatever. Western Bulldogs did it 2016, then Richmond did it last year, winning premierships after a long drought. Now, Collingwood, their drought probably hasn't been as long as those other two, but it seems like a lot has happened in that time, and this is their chance to vindicate themselves given all the acrimony and the controversy around their coach and of course the team itself. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if they won, and given the conditions, it's a cold and wet forecast in Melbourne on Saturday, could that potentially suit the home side? You were saying perhaps yes, but Mason Cox maybe not really in that in those wet conditions. Going to be his height's not going to suit it anyway. But I remember saying this when we were at the Queen's birthday game. I said it as a joke at the time that Mason's going to be the Norm Smith medalist at the end of the year, and now I'm sort of kicking myself as to this could potentially happen. Why didn't I put money on it back then? It probably was 1,000 to 1 the odds or something, so could have had a big payday if it goes off.
Yeah, things have progressed a little bit since then. Even when they were on a roll at that point, no one foresaw them making it to the grand final. Even just being there in September was the objective. So that would have been whoever put money on any kind of situation to do with Collingwood on Saturday, they're going to walk away pretty well off if things do eventuate. So I think that it's just a testament to Cox himself, even though he's been a bit inconsistent when he's on. He's really reminiscent of some of the greats of all time, and that swagger that was evident last Friday, I think, very refreshing for the game to see someone who probably a bit of a a duck out of water, however you want to say it, and he probably isn't 100% aware of all of the elements, but when he does his job right, it's just exhilarating for everyone to watch.
Certainly got the cult following now, doesn't he? Does Mason Cox. So, yeah, all the best to both the teams in the AFL. And I guess it's sort of reminiscent anyway, Collingwood's run of how the North Queensland Cowboys were last season going into the finals too. So I certainly didn't expect them to make the grand final, and given the injuries that they had, you guys were lucky to at least Collingwood were lucky this year to get their players back in time for the finals, where North Queensland were pretty much depleted, but yet still made it to the grand final, beating teams like the Sydney Roosters, Cronulla as well, and ultimately we were decimated by the Melbourne Storm, but still we made it to the grand final, which was it was a fairy tale run, and I'm hoping that it's different for Collingwood this weekend, given that we're in Melbourne, we're Melbourners, we want to see the Melbourne team win.
Yeah, I guess that's not a sentiment too many share. It seems as though a lot of people have tuned out because Collingwood's just a team to despise, regardless of the whole narrative around it, and the fact that they've, for Buckley that is, just the fact that he's been up against it, and then within the season Collingwood's defied all of those odds. They are fully worthy of it, even as a biased supporter. Looking at it objectively, they would be warranting the premiership if they get up. No one can doubt them. But they'll always be the detractors. And for West Coast as well, you'd have to hand it to them. If they win, they've been underrated always. That being on the other side of the Nullarbor, you can always say that they're away from the scrutiny, but not a lot of people give them the credit there. And for them to get up, they really just go about it in a great way. So whoever does prevail, it's not as though they're not Richmond, so clearly they just lucked into it.
Oh, well, it's Daniel Ricciardo's team as well, so you'd hope for them, that's one reason for them to win, but yeah, we're certainly tipping the pies on this one as well. So we'll switch now codes to the NRL too, and Melbourne Storm were the premiers last year. They find themselves in back-to-back grand finals, and they're going to be meeting the Sydney Roosters for the first time at ANZ Stadium. So the first time these two have been in a grand final together. Two of the best teams, you could say, in the past decade or decade and a half in the NRL. And I guess there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of build-up this week, given the news around Billy Slater, and they're actually going to have him for the final game after the judiciary declared him not guilty for that shoulder charge on Sosai Feki in that prelim against the Sharks. So yeah, that's going to be a big boost for Melbourne, chances to go back-to-back, but just the emotion too, that it's Billy Slater's final game and he'd want to go out as a winner and not have to have watched the game from the sideline, because he had to do that in 2016, of course, where he missed that grand final due to that shoulder injury that he had, and I guess he was probably that missing piece in the 2016 final where Melbourne could have beaten Cronulla if they had the wit of Billy Slater on the team.
You can only hope he hasn't played his grand final with that off-field spectacle for really since the Friday night. It was all in preparing that defence, and now they've already returned to Sydney as a group there, so he hasn't had much time where he can just be himself at home at all. Not an ideal preparation, but at least he will be there, and you just hope the Storm do rally to give him the fitting send-off, and it will just be the shame if Cooper Cronk doesn't get up, that he's not there to farewell his great mate regardless of the scoreline, because they're both gladiators and go way back from either end. So you do wonder for Cronk how desperate he will be, whether he'll put himself well and beyond to the point where he might do some long-term damage. You just don't know. We've seen in the past, is it Paul Gallen had a similar injury and he missed out, didn't he? Last
week, Paul Gallen. Well, in the week before, injured his rotator cuff, and then they're saying that it, was probably not as significant as what Cronk's done, yet, it was significant enough for him to miss the prelim against Melbourne last week. So yeah, Cronk probably doing a lot more damage, and chances are that he won't be able to play. But the fairy tale meeting, like, who would have picked it that Cronk leaves Melbourne, goes to the Roosters, and then he gets to square off against his old friends in Billy Slater and Cameron Smith, given that they've had a bit of falling out too since Cronk's decision. So just for the spectacle, it would be nice to see those guys on the field together, playing one another. But yeah, it given Cronk not being there for the Roosters, and they're also missing Dylan Napa still because of that suspension or whatever. You'd think that Storm at full strength will probably outdo the Roosters, but Roosters have been really strong in defence and everything. They get Latrell Mitchell back as well, which is going to be key for them this weekend. He was out suspended for a couple of games too for a crusher tackle, so it's really hard to pick between the two, but if I had to pick one, it would have to be Melbourne.
They would be defying history since the reunited NRL. I guess from 1997 onwards, you've got to go back to when it was the ARL, whatever it was, New South Wales Rugby League, that we had back-to-back winners there. So that would be
25 years. Yeah, 25 years ago that we had back-to-back premiers. So.
Would have been the Broncos back then. They won about 6 of them in the 90s. So the Storm, as much as they've been dominant, they've never been able to string together successive titles. So that would probably put them, especially after the way they started this decade with that acrimony of the salary cap debacle there, to win. This would be, 4 flags in 7 seasons, plus the couple that they lost from last decade. That'd be ridiculous. That'd be something like 6 flags when you include those in 12 years. That's going to have to go down as an all-time great achievement.
Yeah, given that you've had the likes of Cameron Smith, Billy Slater, and then up until this, of course, last year, Cooper Cronk there, and under Coach Bellamy as well. So, it's really a dynasty that they're building. And, I'm just impressed with Melbourne that they've done it all year, been successful without actually having a permanent halfback there. So ever since Cronk left, of course, they've sort of chopped and changed between Brodie Croft, Jerome Hughes, Riley Jacks. So Brodie Croft's been named as number 7 for this weekend for the grand final, but it wouldn't be surprising if you have someone like a Jerome Hughes or Riley Jacks pop up and play in that position for a period of time as well.
And you'd expect them really to probably go somewhere they're familiar with in terms of positions. You're not going to see too many drastic changes short of necessary inclusions. And the Roosters probably, again, they're similar enough to West Coast, even though we're in the they're in the fishbowl in Sydney, whereas Melbourne, I guess, we're the ones who are the out-of-towners when it comes to NRL, but probably the Roosters do deserve a bit more credit there, and they did pinch that minor premiership, so it'd be folly to dismiss them.
Yeah, exactly, and I guess because they're missing Cronk, that could be a big thing, but, they spent a lot of bucks, I guess, this year bringing Cooper Cronk and also James Tedesco over from the Tigers to strengthen the team, and Trent Robinson been given that faith or whatever to bring another premiership to the Roosters. It's been a long time, and I guess if they fall short this year, you could probably pin it on Cooper Cronk not being present, but at the same time, they've got the likes of Tedesco there, Latrell Mitchell's back, Boyd Cordner, Jake Friend, their 2 co-captains, and of course, Blake Ferguson's been in form as well, in which will be his final game for the Roosters too before he goes to Parramatta. So, it's going to be a great contest, and I really can't wait for that one as well as the AFL come Saturday.
Bit of a smorgasbord there, particularly that Sunday 7 o'clock kickoff, leading almost immediately into the Russian Grand Prix. So we'll be having some split duties.
As we said at the top of the podcast, the racing almost seems secondary this week, and it's all
as
about.
It will for F1 in 7 days later, when it's going to be all eyes on Bathurst, and your forced duties for the blog somehow reluctantly you'll have to shun Bathurst onto the secondary screen.
Exactly.
For,
so
3rd, 4th year in a row.
Exactly. So up until then, thanks for tuning in today. Hopefully we've got a lot to talk about next week, of course, with the Russian Grand Prix, the footy outcome, and previewing the Bathurst 1000. This is why October's such a good month. Daylight savings, a lot of sport, and the sunshine comes back. It's all happening. So thanks very much for tuning in this time, and we'll see you next week.
Till then, go